Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We'll just give things a minute to allow folks to enter the webinar. Thanks so much. Okay, I think we'll get started. Hello and welcome. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Tara King, and I am a Senior Project Director at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, or AAAS for short. AAAS is the world's largest general science association and the publisher of the Science family of journals. There, I serve as the center coordinator for the S-STEM Resource and Evaluation Center, which we abbreviate as the S-STEM REC. The AAAS S-STEM REC is happy to organize this webinar, facilitated by our partners at the American Institutes for Research. Lots of abbreviations. They're abbreviated as AIR. Today's session is the first webinar in a two-part series which aims to help you better understand quasi-experimental evaluation designs and provide guidance on how you can implement them in your S-STEM projects. So I always like to get started by seeing who is joining us today and what you all are curious about coming into the webinar based on the topic. So I invite you to take a second to use the chat to say hello, introduce yourself. You can say your institution, your S-STEM award track, if you'd like to. And if you have an initial question, feel free to pose that in the chat as well. I'll move forward while you all are doing that with some housekeeping and logistics. So we invite you all to keep your cameras on if you'd like to do so, but it's your preference if you'd prefer to have them off. We do ask you to please keep yourself muted during the presentation. However, when we get to the Q&A towards the end, and if you wish to ask your question verbally, please use the raise your hand button, and then we'll call on you to ask your question that way. Please continue to introduce yourself in the chat, and please use the chat at any time throughout this webinar to ask questions. As I mentioned, we'll have plenty of time for your questions to be answered towards the end. Closed captioning is made available. Thank you to our live transcriptioner, Annabelle, who is providing captions for us today. And our slides and recordings will be made available. Actually, the slides are available right now. If you'd like to follow along with the slides, you can download them here. And then once the recording has been edited, we'll post it to our website. We hope everything goes smoothly for you, technical wise, but if you have any issues, please contact my colleague, Rachel Stivers, either directly through the chat or by sending an email at rstivers@AAAS.org. And one final item is that we have a short survey for you to take as a participant of our session. We really value your feedback and appreciate you sharing your thoughts. We use these results to help us think about future sessions to be offered and how we modify our offerings. So please, when you exit Zoom, the survey will appear live on your screen. And then tomorrow we'll also be able to email you the survey as well if you don't have time to take it right now. So thanks in advance for your feedback on that. So I always like to start things by talking about S-STEM and the REC to ground the conversations. As those of you engaged in S-STEM projects are aware, the NSF S-STEM program aims to increase the success of low-income, academically talented students with demonstrated financial need who are pursuing degrees in STEM fields. So S-STEM really builds a stronger U.S. STEM workforce while fostering innovation across the nation. We're so pleased to staff the AAAS STEM Resource and Evaluation Center, or REC for short. The REC was established in 2022 through a competitive NSF proposal process, and we work to build community and share effective practices and strategies across the STEM network. The REC supports capacity building of STEM project leaders and scholars, and we're also charged with synthesizing the outcomes of STEM projects nationwide. We encourage you to explore our website at stemrec.AAAS.org for more details. So the REC is led by AAAS in collaboration with our partner organizations. And AIR, or American Institutes for Research, is one of our partners. Our AIR colleagues collect and analyze data from the STEM community to create national STEM impact and outcomes reports. We welcome you to visit our website and download their first report, which was released in 2025. And let me put those links in the chat so you have them available. And currently, AIR is working to, sorry about that. AIR is currently working to produce a second outcomes and impacts report, which will be published in fall of 2027. So without further ado, I want to turn things over to my colleague, Joseph Taylor, who, along with Melissa Rogers, will be providing the facilitation of the content for today's webinar. Joe, take it away.
Yeah. Thank you, Tara. I'm Joe Taylor. Pleasure to get to see everyone here today at the webinar. I'm a principal researcher at AIR, and as you can see by my background, I'm headquartered, so to speak, here in Colorado Springs, Colorado. I'm a co-PI on the AIR portion of the STEM REC. And with that, I'll turn it over to Melissa to say more about herself.
Joe. Good afternoon. I'm Melissa Rogers. I'm also a researcher at American Institutes for Research, or AIR, and I'm the meta-analytic lead of the STEM REC evaluation team at AIR. Most of my other work focuses on conducting systematic reviews of primary research studies and applying advanced meta-analytic methods to estimate average impacts for education and other social science-like interventions. I'm going to jump us right in to the purpose and learning objectives of this part 1 webinar. The purpose of the webinar is to provide you with a conceptual understanding of why quasi-experimental designs, or QEDs, are used, what problems they solve, and different threats to validity that still remain. This webinar focuses on 2-group designs and provides guidance on how to establish a non-randomized comparison group, which will be helpful for your design and conducting of evaluations of your funded STEM projects. In terms of our learning objectives, we'll first help you identify the difference between study designs, including single versus multiple group designs, and within multiple groups, the randomized control trial, or RCT as it's commonly known, versus the quasi-experimental, or QED study. We'll also help you understand the benefits of a QED study with 2 groups to estimate project impacts, while also mitigating the threats to validity. Third, we'll help you figure out how to develop that non-randomized comparison group for your STEM project using 3 different types of strategies. And then we'll also provide guidance around this, developing your own to scope your own QED study using a comparison group, and potentially consider applying some more advanced propensity score methods, which will be the focus of our second follow-up webinar in about a month. So part 2 to come. So, so what we will discuss today, I'll just provide a quick overview of that. I'll begin with an overview of the single versus multiple group designs, as well as differentiating between RCTs and QEDs. I'll then detail why comparison groups matter and why having 2 groups can help improve study results, but also acknowledging that certain challenges still remain related to validity. Joe Taylor will then provide a more detailed introduction to QEDs and 3 different options to identify a comparison group, specifically related and grounded in your S-STEM project evaluations. He will also then introduce you to some study design versus analytic strategies that can improve the strength and evidence of your S-STEM projects. And as Tara mentioned, we'll have a brief Q&A and encourage you to submit questions either verbally or through the chat. And then finally, we'll conclude with a preview of the next webinar, part 2, that we'll be offering in about a month, which focuses on the more technical extensions of today's contents. Okay, so kicking it off with our design overview. The first differentiation is the number of groups that are included in a given study. So we've got single groups on the left-hand side and multiple groups on the right-hand side of this figure. The single group designs are focused specifically on the intervention group, or students who are recipients of the S-STEM project in your case. These can be descriptive, collected at one time point, which might report information on group experiences, implementation, or outcomes. For example, a single group descriptive study might focus on graduation rates for the S-STEM scholars at the end of each cohort. Single group designs can also be constructed to collect data at 2 or more time points, which allows for an assessment of the intervention over time. These are referred to as pre-test, post-test designs, again, with just a focus on the single intervention group. For example, this type of design could collect a measure of self-efficacy of S-STEM scholars before and after the first project year. So now shifting to multiple group designs, this implies that there is at least one intervention group, here your scholars, and one comparison group. The comparison group is where students do not receive the intervention, can be established in different ways. For RCTs, the treatment and control group are determined through, you can probably guess, a randomized process. So students are randomly assigned to an intervention group or a comparison group. This design is often not feasible for an S-STEM project, where intervention groups are selected scholars based on merit and other criteria. When groups are determined through a non-randomized process, this type of study is typically referred to as a quasi-experimental design, or QED. The identification of a comparison group relies on different strategies. For S-STEM projects, this would be the identification of a non-scholar comparison group, and then designing an evaluation where both baseline and outcome data are collected and then analyzed between the 2 groups. I'll now provide a little bit more information about these different designs, but just wanted to let you know that the focus of the webinar is developing of a comparison group and the implication for multiple group QED designs, so the one in green. So in terms of single group designs, these designs examine outcomes for one group measured at 1 or more time points. They're often only feasible. They're the only feasible option in small projects or settings where comparison groups can't be created. Their strength is describing the patterns of change, not establishing whether or not the project caused that change. Descriptive designs have a single time point, and they are kind of the lowest bar for reporting of your S-STEM project effects. They're valuable for understanding context, participant characteristics, program implementation, but they can't support claims about whether the project impacted students, because there is no pre-intervention baseline information, and more about that a little bit later. In terms of the pre and post-test measures, design measures, the same group will be measured before and after some amount of time in the project participation. In many S-STEM projects, this may be the only realistic design option because, again, cohorts are small, scholars are selected due to merit and eligibility, and they really can't be randomly assigned. Apologies. Pre-post data can show whether outcomes improved over time, but without a comparison group, it is impossible to know whether the program caused the change or whether the change would have happened anyway. And this gets us to the threats for validity in single group designs. So these threats for validity occur in single group designs, even if they're measured at multiple time points. The first of which is, sorry. So when we use a single group design, it's easy to make a mistake. It's easy to mistake natural or external changes for actual project effects. Some of the common threats that can make it look like a project work even when something else may be responsible include history. So history refers to outside events that occurred during the project period, or rather between maybe the pre and post tests. For example, if the campus introduces a new resource for students, or a faculty member within a STEM department changes their teaching approach, and these outside influences might improve outcomes independently of the project. The second is maturation, and that's about natural changes over time. So regardless of project participation, participants may grow, learn, change, and simply because time passes. And we surely hope so, because they're in college. And those changes can look like project effects, even when the project element has nothing to do with them. Third, we have testing effects. Testing effects happen when taking a pretest influences how people perform on the post-test. For instance, participants may remember the question, become more comfortable with the format, or adjust their behavior based on what they saw during the first pretest measurement. And finally, single group designs can utilize statistical adjustments or techniques where results are included in control for measured variables, such as demographic or pretest measures in the pre-post test design. However, they are limited, and adjustment alone does not support causal conclusions. So basically it fails to solve the core problem of single group designs. Without a comparison group, even sophisticated methods cannot establish what would happen to participants without the program. So in summary, single group designs cannot isolate program effects from other influences. They're still valuable for understanding implementation, participant experiences, etc., but they do not qualify as impact evaluations. So that brings us to multiple group designs, and specifically, what is the benefit and why include a comparison group, which is the main clutch selling point of this entire webinar. So in order to draw impact conclusions, we need a way to separate project effects from everything else that could influence outcomes. So a comparison group provides that anchor. It gives us a point of reference for what would have happened in the absence of a project. And once we have those two groups to compare, differences in outcomes can be interpreted of project impact rather than the artifacts previously described as history, maturation, or even selection into the program. Finally, in addition, there's a stronger evidence of impact when groups are similar at baseline, or in other words, balanced. So the inclusion of a comparison group is the turning point from asking and being able to answer the question, what changed, to what difference did the program actually make? So among the different types of multiple group designs, we've talked about RCTs, randomized control trials, and QEDs. I'll now directly contrast these on some key points specifically related to your S-STEM project. In RCTs, participants are randomly assigned. This is considered the gold standard of research designs because groups are ideally comparable and balanced by the actual study design. QEDs do not randomize participants. So for S-STEM projects, scholars are assigned to the intervention group, and a comparison group needs to be identified by other available non-scholar students. In RCTs, these are really often not feasible for S-STEM projects due to the way in which scholarships are assigned, the rules related to those assignments, and they basically typically preclude a level of random assignment altogether. There are also ethical constraints that may prevent withholding scholarships or services, and logical issues like small cohorts, rolling admissions, or limited staff that can make this randomization even further impossible. When randomization is not possible, QEDs offer a practical alternative for including multiple groups. They rely on identifying a non-randomized or non-equivalent comparison group, which students who did not participate in the program but are similar enough. And with careful design and appropriate statistical tools, such matching or weighting can improve baseline balance and then strengthen causal claims by establishing equivalence on observed characteristics. There will still probably be non-equivalence on those unobserved characteristics, but more about that later with regard to design and analytic strategies from Joe Taylor. Just to sum up sort of the known limitations that still exist with regard to QEDs, that really then leads to the focus on the design and analysis strategies that may help to establish stronger evidence. The first limitation, First limitation is non-random assignment. As we've mentioned, I think now I've said it many a time. Groups may differ because they are self or project selected processes and not just because they've been in the project itself. Second, maybe, okay, well, they're all going out there now. Second is approximating the counterfactual. So the counterfactual is the best estimate of what would have happened if the S-STEM project had not occurred. And that is the main source of including a comparison group and one that would be balanced and similar in baseline characteristics to your treatment group. Since we don't have a true randomized counterfactual, QEDs can only approximate this impact estimate. Third, observable versus unobservable differences. Statistical methods can adjust for measured characteristics, but unmeasured factors will undoubtedly remain and may result in bias in the results. And then finally, internal validity concerns. Baseline differences in group identification processes can mimic program effects if not carefully addressed. An example of this would be students that end up in the S-STEM scholarship program are already underlyingly more driven and more likely to succeed than those that were not selected. I'm now going to pass it off to Joe Taylor, who will take it from here, describing QEDs and the three options for identifying those comparison groups.
Thank you, Melissa. Okay, I'd like to continue by describing the key design features of QEDs with two groups. In this design, a comparison group is essential to knowing whether the program really makes a difference. And because the treatment and comparison groups are formed without random assignment, establishing baseline equivalence or balance is critical. That equivalence ideally would be assessed directly, and as Melissa mentioned, while typical approaches to statistical adjustment, such as regression, can help address those differences, it cannot fully correct for poor baseline balance between groups. And finally, different options for comparison groups, they offer different trade-offs. Which is what I will address in the next few slides. I'm just going to reveal all of these so I can talk about them at once. Okay. There we go. Okay, so within the S-STEM context, there are three common design options for non-randomized comparison groups. Starting in the far left column, The first option is eligible non-participants. These are students who met the eligibility requirements, but for whatever reason did not receive the scholarship. The second option in the middle column there those are applicants who were not selected. These are students who applied for the scholarship program and were not chosen, either because they didn't meet eligibility requirements or for some other reason. And then finally, on the far right column, we have the third option, which is matched students within the same institution. And these are students who are similar to scholarship recipients, but they did not participate in the project at all, and many of them likely did not even apply for the scholarship. And I'll say a little bit more about each of these. Okay, with regard to option one, again, the comparison group consists of students who met all the criteria for the scholarship but didn't receive it. And this can happen for a variety of reasons, including limited funding, they applied late, they declined the award, etc. This option works well because the comparison students are similar to the scholars on observed eligibility criteria, which helps remove scholarship selection processes and criteria as a potential confound to knowing whether the program works. Key considerations around this option include the need to clearly document why some eligible students didn't receive the scholarship, and assessing whether the non-recipients differ in meaningful ways, such as motivation or financial circumstances. Assessing these differences would be in addition to the typical best practice of assessing baseline equivalence on demographic and outcome data. Now moving to option two. Again, these are students who applied for the STEM scholarship but weren't selected. This option can work well because the applicants, we know at least they have demonstrated interest in the program and motivation for the program, regardless of whether they met eligibility requirements, and that the application data are likely readily available for analysis. Key considerations here would include the fact that we may not know whether these students met the eligibility requirements, and if the reasons for not getting the scholarship were related to factors that are correlated with outcomes, such as academic merit, financial need. So if that were the case, then we would potentially have a problematic differences in characteristics between treatment and comparison groups that would need to be addressed. Bottom line here is that the differences between the selected and non-selected applicants should be addressed analytically, and clear documentation of the selection criteria is essential so that the differences can be addressed in the downstream design or analysis strategies. And then in option three, again, this comparison group includes students from the same institution and ideally the same program, academic program, as the scholarship recipients, but who may or may not have even applied for the scholarship. So this option has it going for it that at least the institutional context is controlled and held constant, and that the administrative data that one would use to match treatment and control is likely going to be available through the university's institutional office. But again, this group in particular, there's a strong possibility that comparison students within the institution may differ in important unobserved ways that are correlated with outcomes, and such as their motivation or their existing support networks. So overall, a design with this kind of comparison group is likely to have key differences across groups. So strong baseline data are needed to assess the similarity between the groups, and careful design and analytic adjustments are critical. Okay, so let's summarize those three with a graphic. So in this graphic, the green figures, those are the scholarship in the scholarship treatment box. Those are the awardees. And as we move from left to right, the green figures in the subsequent comparison group boxes represent the individuals who are similar to the scholarship awardees. The blue figures are students who are not so similar to the awardees. And as we move from left to right, the differences between the scholarship recipients and the comparison groups likely increase. as indicated by the increasing number of blue figures as you move from left to right. All of this is to say that as you move from left to right across these comparison groups, the need for balancing tools and strategies becomes more pronounced. So, once a comparison group is selected, what strategies can we use to improve balance between the groups? Well, there are both design strategies and analysis strategies to improve balance between groups. Design strategies include using propensity score matching to select comparison students who are most similar to the project participants, or propensity score weighting so that comparison students more closely resemble program participants overall. Analysis strategies are probably familiar to most of you, and those include regression adjustment to control for remaining differences between the groups. That is, any confounds to assessing the program's impact. The key takeaway here is that we have both design and analysis strategies at our disposal, and the aim of each of these is to recreate, at least on the measured characteristics, the balance one would expect in a randomized study. A quick note about regression before we move on here is that historically in evaluation, regression has been a go-to approach for creating balance across groups. But we should note here the limitations of regression adjustment as a balancing strategy. Simply put, regression adjustment typically is not sufficient to address unbalanced groups in quasi-experimental designs, and that's largely because regression only controls for measured variables, right? By this, we mean only the variables we have at our disposal for the evaluation. And the results depend heavily on model choices, that is, the specific set of variables that we choose to put in our model. And when groups are very different from one another, regression adjustment can produce some misleading results. Bottom line, regression works best when it's combined with strong design principles such as matching or weighting. Advance too quickly on one. Here we go. Okay, so starting to pull some ideas together here. So far, we've established some limitations of regression adjustment and have alluded to the existence of these propensity score matching and weighting methods, as well established design strategies for QEDs. As such, our summary recommendation is to combine these tools to provide a stronger evidence of impact than what would be produced relying on either the design or the analysis methods alone. Specifically, we recommend what sometimes people use the term in evaluation, a doubly robust approach, which employs both types of strategies, design and analysis. Okay, time for a summary of some major takeaways. The first is that comparison groups are essential to estimating project impact with high confidence of a true causal effect. And when random assignment is not possible, which is often the case in S-STEM projects, quasi-experimental designs are often most feasible in the next strongest design. We discussed today how different comparison group options involve trade-offs, both with regard to scholar similarity and with feasibility of implementation. And paramount to any comparison group design is establishing baseline equivalence to increase the confidence in our impact estimates. Finally, combining design strategies such as matching or weighting with analyses strategies such as regression likely provides the stronger evidence than using either approach alone. And with that, I would like to open up the floor for Melissa and I to facilitate discussion from the participants.
Feel free to use either the chat or the raise your hand button if you'd like to voice a question. Kelly, I see you've put a question in the chat. I don't know if you would like to provide more to it. Um, if so, yeah, feel free to unmute yourself.
Just with, at least with track ones, the N is, maybe 15, sometimes less. And you really do have, in my opinion, limited, statistical analysis. They just talk about the limitations of low N.
Yeah. So I can take the first crack at that one. Thank you, Kelly, for that question. I think my initial reaction is to make sure that the evaluation isn't overly focused on statistical significance as the only way to think about program impacts. Obviously, the small n's are going to reduce the probability that you'll detect a statistically significant effect, but also thinking about practical significance, so maybe estimating impacts using standardized mean difference measures, which are largely sample size independent, can give you a way to talk about whether you're observing a meaningful difference outside of statistical significance alone.
The other thing I'd add to that is sometimes if your treatment group is small, but you get a larger comparison group, using propensity score matching and weighting, it's actually a powerful thing because if you have a larger comparison to pick from, that you might be able to get a more balanced design. But more about that in webinar part 2, in detail.
Joe and Melissa, I'm curious for those who have projects that currently are running and they don't have a QED design, what can they do to maximize impact validity?
Well, I think one affordance of a quasi-experimental design, especially if one is using administrative data, is that the access to that data is there, and one can go back retrospectively and collect that data on a synthetic comparison group, even though the program delivery may be far on down the line. That doesn't mean that we can't go back in time to get administrative data around student characteristics and their outcomes.
Christy, go ahead. Oh, you're on mute, I believe.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can.
Okay. I don't know what that was. This is my first time serving as a PI, and our first cohort is just about to finish their first year. And, so hearing some of this, I'm thinking about best practices for, changing our methods as we, move to the second cohort or the third cohort. I'm having a hard time like seeing the end and how to optimize what we'll be able to learn. So, if we were, we have a QED type of design, not that I had ever heard of that term before, but and I'll confess. But I'm thinking, maybe not maybe, I'm confident that our method of choosing that comparison group could be improved. Should we try to improve it for the second cohort? Thanks.
Well, we hope, Christy, if you can make the second webinar, that we'll be giving you some concrete tools in the domain of propensity score methods that would help you dial in that balance between the treatment comparison groups.
Yeah, and I would echo Joe's previous comment that There's nothing to say you can't improve it, at least for administrative outcomes and
Yeah.
baseline stats for your first cohort, because you can collect that information retrospectively. So you can establish your comparison group um, at the point of analysis. They don't actually need to participate. But I do think that it does make a difference what that outcome is. So if you are interested in some more of the maybe motivational type of measures, things that are collected via survey, like I've seen in some of the evaluations related to like self-efficacy in STEM or other sorts of things, when including that as an outcome and with an established comparison group, that does require a little bit more foresight, be able to collect that information from a specific group of people. And then it's at their whim if they actually would like to, provide that information without any sort of intervention, help, or scholarship. So that does make a difference. And I think that kind of gets at your question, Mary, in the chat, about really recruiting comparison group students. I think we're very much speaking to outcomes that can be obtained through administrative data.
Okay. Yeah, I
Yeah.
wondered about that because many of the dimensions of sort of the impact with regard to specific skills, and various things have been through survey or
Yes.
assessment data collection. And it's just been really, really tough to get more than just a handful for a comparison group. So certainly if we're looking at persistence or other things where the administrative data are there, that's a whole different animal. But for some of the other evaluations, STEM evaluations that we've been involved in, we've really tried to look much more broadly than that. And it's just been a challenge. So yeah, thanks.
I would say, if you can get that group, even if it's small and your scholar group is
Yeah,
small,
and that's what we've
it's
done.
still
Yeah.
it's
We've
still
taken what we
worthwhile
get
collecting it. I mean,
and
if you can do it, that's
yeah,
great. And reporting both of
yeah,
those is great. Um,
exactly.
and knowing, where that population came from and knowing those limitations. You might not
Yeah,
be able to apply these more
exactly.
statistical adjustment methods,
Right.
but it still is a more worthwhile to have the multiple groups versus
That's
the
been our
single group.
bias. Yeah,
Yeah.
we've always wanted to include it versus not. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm a huge proponent for mixed methods anyway, and so
Yeah.
some of the
Okay.
qualitative stuff and even small n stuff, I've always still found it valuable as long as you put the limitations around it, like you all
Yeah.
have articulated very well. As long as that's there too, people can take or leave what you're telling them, but often I do think it's valuable. So I appreciate that.
Melissa and Joe, any recommendations for assessing impacts from scholars after the project has ended, actually?
Yeah, that's probably somewhat institution specific in terms of how well they track graduates for the purposes of collecting downstream outcomes from them. Was there a specific outcome that someone was interested in tracking post-graduation, like STEM workforce things? Is that the interest?
Or ways that,
Yeah.
like as Mary put in the chat, putting personal,
Okay.
getting their email address. So
Mhm.
I think in particular, following scholars' path, like into the workforce, graduate school, like knowing where they're going, is very important. And how
Very.
do you track that? And I don't, Mary had put the suggestion of personal email addresses and how, I don't know if Mary, you want to talk more about like how you even
Yeah.
obtain those from scholars.
Yeah, and this just gets back to sort of my experience with this kind of work has always included some direct assessment with students. And so sometimes the faculty working with them have some of this, and most of the time they don't. And so just as part of the other data collection that we do, we ask them not within the same assessment for confidentiality purposes, but we send them to another landing site if they're willing, and then they can provide their their personal email if they're willing to provide information, and we explain why.
Yeah.
we make the persuasive case for why we're asking for this, and then we promise, it's, we're only talking about a very limited sort of once a year thing for a couple of years, just to exactly to see, what you're doing, whether you're going on to other training, whether you're employed, if you're employed, what field you're employed in. And most of the time, it's fairly low risk and low intrusion, especially these days. So it's like, oh, okay, if that's what you need. And many of them will do that, but it's just one of the things that I've noted sometimes also working with PIs and others. I encourage them, if you are gathering data separate from your university data gathering for this group, please make sure that you gather their personal email and not just their university email.
Yeah. Well, and this is making me think a little bit about your other question, Mary, about incentives, right? Because you probably would hope to incentivize longitudinal data collection.
Exactly.
Maybe we could crowdsource your question and see if any other PIs who are on the call have tried different incentive strategies successfully in what they did. What have you tried, Mary, while we're waiting?
I can tell you what hasn't worked, because that's why I put in there. What do you do about? I mean, we always incentivize this with students. We always incentivize because there's so much competing for their time, and their interest is less than, perhaps others. So we always provide monetary incentives by way of gift cards. You can do it by cash. It's just more bureaucratically painful to do that. But generally we do gift cards. And if we're asking for, half hour of their time, usually we, 20 minutes to a half hour, $10. If we want them to do an in-depth interview or a focus group or whatever, it may be 25, those kinds of things. So that's what we've done. And for the most part, the individuals who are direct beneficiaries of the program are going to obviously be more likely to go, oh yeah, okay, I'll do it. But those that aren't, don't have that incentive. And so we've just found that that differential is tough. And then ethically, it's hard to do an incentive differential, because if you're compensating them for their time, then I'm not going to pay somebody a lot more for their time than somebody else. So it's just, we've thought about it. It's tricky.
Kind of thinking off the cuff here. It would be interesting though, like if you were able to get non-scholar more longitudinal outcomes, potentially ask them in a way that might align with institutional level outcomes, so that you could say, like, how did these scholars that, yes, probably are included in the institutional summary, but like, is there anything out there with longitudinal data that you could narrow down to your specific university to be able to make that comparison? That's a little outside of the three options we offered here, and definitely not going to hit any level of baseline. But I mean, that is something to really think about. Like, if you are able to engage the scholars, I think it'd be pretty hard to engage the non-scholars. I don't know how that would work, but if you could engage the scholars, then being able to get that information would be interesting.
Sorry, I'm from AIR as well, and I just thought of something. Hi, Melissa. Hi, Joe. Are there, I mean, thinking of non-scholars, one thing that have worked in the past in some institutions is if there are similar programs that's getting some benefit from the institution or within similar departments, like that's another incentive for, hey, would you be willing to participate so we can come, especially if it's a similar STEM program, it's just a different program in which they're getting some mentorship and financial aid from, you can compare some of their feelings and stuff like that. So that's just like another way of thinking of another group we could potentially tap into as well. And I know for the small sample size issue as well, like one of the things we've done is, if it's possible, because for projects that are new and you don't have this already, but there's a possibility of combining cohorts longitudinally, and you can like control for that cohort effects in our regression model, in addition to some of the things Joe and Melissa mentioned as well. So just different ideas that we can continue to grapple with.
Just like to give opportunity for Bonnie in the chat has talked about um, not for an S-STEM project, but for other projects tracking undergraduate to first year post graduation. If they're enrolled in a grad school or a job in the field. I don't know if Bonnie, I welcome you to come off mute if you'd like to speak more to your experience doing that.
I guess I just I suggest that the PI does that as the evaluator. I find that I don't have the same type of relationship that the PI has with participants. If you're talking about comparison group designs, I sort of forgot that for a second, but I guess you could incentivize the comparison group to self-report that as well. But generally, the PIs that I've worked with, some have a very few have a good follow up and have a good experience doing that. But for the most part, they they'll say that they will and they don't, or they just have trouble doing it for whatever reason. So it's tough, but I do like the idea of sort of having a cutoff, like after so many months, even 6 months, like or they if they applied, might be a good idea as an indicator, but and then you could compare over time in case you're getting better with one cohort versus another in say a 5 or 6 year project. You could get a couple of compares. You could get a couple cohorts and look at those, but nothing is not like quasi-experimental. Haven't done that, but thinking maybe I could with if we could provide an incentive for the other group with the treatment group. I think, like I said, the PI should have good enough relationship with the students in order to just follow up with them, provided they have another type of contact, like their cell phone or something, that they can reach them, because they don't generally check their email at the college from which they graduated.
And David, do you have a question around representativeness, validity that you'd like to ask?
Yeah, so the reason, and thank you, Bonnie, for jumping in there. I appreciate that. The reason I was asking is that we've tried to do similar things here at the Community College of Aurora, but there's always the question of, okay, do we know that, if we have a self-reported, oh, I'm working for, I don't know, I'm going to make up a company, Raytheon. How long does that last? Do we know, like, in what capacity? As we have the new environment with compliance for federal student aid, we're needing to have that workforce information, so we know which of our students are employed and what is their salary and everything. But I was curious if there were other alternatives, or if there were existing methods to make sure we have those data that could be useful. So it sounds like mostly self-reporting up to this point, and then we'll see what we can do with labor market data going forward.
Yeah, I've done it with labor market data for Department of Labor grants, but not for like S-STEM. Those are larger groups and a lot more money.
Okay.
invested, and you have to sort of pay people to pull that data. So it's just not feasible with this NSF
Yeah,
particular
that makes
program.
sense. Thank you.
But David, I'm sensitive to your point about we know that the longitudinal data will only come from a subsample of the scholars that you touched while they're with you. So kind of making sure that the sample of graduates who provide the longitudinal data mirrors the profile of them as scholars would be important in saying that that's still an impact.
Any other questions? Joe and Melissa, can I throw out one more question that might be helpful for the audience before we go to like wrap up slides? So I'm wondering, are there any resources like publications, websites, things that you can point to for examples of evaluations that you would recommend as models? And maybe even on the flip side, are there practices or things that you've seen from S-STEM projects that you actually would warn against doing, like some practices to avoid? So sort of like some, things to look for and things to avoid. Melissa, you're shaking your head.
Very, very good question there, Tara. Very good question. I don't have evaluations off the top of my head, but through the search that we're doing, everything that we're accessing is publicly available. We've seen that the majority of the studies we've screened so far are very much conference abstracts or proposals, so very short in nature and sort of what's coming next. But I do think we've seen a couple of like key ones, and that may be something, Joe, you and I can talk about including in part of the next year's report as some like go-to examples of studies that have done a very good job reporting out information, applying these more more technical design and analytics. I would say the pitfall and what not to do. Please give me the standard deviations. Please don't just give me the means. That's one thing that is a regular thing with just the results of making sure you report out your N, your means, and your standard deviations for your outcomes. That's like a very important factor. And then I think one big thing like we've addressed here is, failing to attempt to create a comparison group to allow for those impact estimates. But Joe, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but those are my gut reactions there.
Well, just keeping the meta-analytic lens on here for one more minute is that if we're synthesizing quasi-experiments, the effect sizes that are derived from quasi-experiments are more defensibly combinable together. It's much harder to defend combining like a pre-post effect size with a effect size that's based on two different groups. So not only does it lead to stronger evaluation evidence, but it also allows us more often include those impact estimates in our synthetic work.
Thank you both, Joe and Melissa, so much, and for our participants for asking great questions and having really good discussion about difficult issues and challenges with getting, data from scholars, especially. I do want to pass it over to Melissa, who wants to preview the part two, and we welcome you to join our part two of this series. Oops, sorry about that.
Okay. So there we go. So just looking ahead, our webinar part 2 series is going to be in a little less than a month, on April 14th at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time, virtual again, very similar experientially this way. We are welcoming all PIs to join, and we also encourage you to invite your evaluators if you have identified who those individuals are, as this will be a little bit more technical. It's going to focus on using propensity score methods, so a little bit what Joe alluded to earlier, to improve the comparison group design. So you've established your comparison group, and now you're able to apply some of these design and analytic methods to make them doubly robust, with consideration towards matching and weighting. We'll also include how to assess that balance, so the balance equivalence, and other types of diagnostics that you'd run on a model to make sure and make a stronger argument of impact evidence. And then we're also going to be able to provide some actual practical examples and things for implementation considerations. So some of what we discussed here today, but with a little bit more
And Melissa freeze, or is it just my screen?
Looks like she
Okay.
did.
Okay.
Oh,
Um,
Here we are.
no problem. You're back now, Melissa, I think.
I'm
You froze. Yeah.
yes, it just told me that I'm unstable. It's always a fun thing. Yes, but I'm not sure where I left off, but we're going to provide some practical examples and implementation considerations as well in this webinar again on Tuesday, April 14th. And I believe that Tara put the link in the chat to register for that.
Yes, thank you. Join us as we dig into this topic deeper. And our last ask for you is to please complete our post-event survey. This is a great way for us to get feedback from you on potential future topics for webinars and ways we can change or improve our offerings for you. Thank you so much in advance for doing so. And of course, please, we welcome you to stay engaged, stay connected with the S-STEM Resource and Evaluation Center events, both virtual and in person. As you know, many of you know, we'll be hosting our 2026 S-STEM Scholars and PI meeting, and that's a very large meeting. And actual, PIs, evaluators, researchers, like anybody affiliated with an S-STEM project can come. They can register to attend. And of course, for those PIs, please remember to nominate your scholars by the end of this month, and we'll do a scholar selection. And it's just such an exciting, wonderful, energetic meeting, and we're so looking forward to hosting it this year in Washington, D.C. But yes, all that to say, please stay connected and engage with us. Thank you for spending your time with us today and sharing your thoughts and questions on this topic. And thanks again to our AAR colleagues, Joe and Melissa, for sharing their expertise with us. Have a great day, everybody. Hope to see you in the future.